Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, we will start our proceeding with a recitation from the Holy Quran.
शुरू अल्लाह का नाम लेकर जो बड़ा मेहरबान निहायत रहम वाला है। इन्ना अअतैनाकल कौसर, ए नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम, हमने तुमको कौसर यानी बहुत ज्यादा भलाई अता फरमाई है। फसल्लि लिरब्बिक वन्हर, तो अपने परवरदिगार के लिए नमाज पढ़ा करो और कुर्बानी किया करो। इन्न शानिअक हुवल अबतर, कुछ शक नहीं कि तुम्हारा दुश्मन ही बेनाम रहेगा।
Distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, Chairman Board of Governors, and Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry, Director General Institute of Studies, I warmly welcome you all at today's webinar on a very important topic, that is changing global arms control norms, prospects and challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also take this opportunity to inform you that this webinar is organized by Arms Control and Disarmament Center, which is just recently established under the leadership of Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry on October 30th, 2019. The center was established with a vision to contribute focused research and quality policy input with in-depth analysis and dialogue on issues of arms control, disarmament, nuclear safety and security, nuclear deterrence, emerging technologies, and challenges to peace and strategic stability. Ladies and gentlemen, with reference to our today's webinar, as we all know that the world is witnessing a shift in global arms control norms and the existing arms control mechanism, which is being termed as outdated and exhausted. Some even believe that the arms control structure, which once had enjoyed its global golden age, has come to an end, as new arms races at international regional levels are picking up paces. States have started to increase their military spending and are modernizing their nuclear and conventional weapons capability. Even major powers are indicating resumption of nuclear testing as the reliance on nuclear weapon use is growing, and they are constructing war-fighting doctrines around these weapons. Some major powers have already pulled out of key bilateral arms control treaties and agreements. They are developing new and advanced low-yield nuclear weapons and their ultimate delivery system. In addition, states are also investing in disruptive and emerging technology. They are deploying lethal autonomous weapons, and they are also weaponizing the outer space. So these new technology-driven competition has even dominated the cyberspace. So therefore, keeping in mind these emerging trends and shifts in the global arms control norm, the ACDC has organized this webinar to explore the following. Number one, what are the dynamics of change in the existing global arms control norm? Is this emerging order going to witness a great power competition, or it is going to increase the prospects of engagement and cooperation? Number two, how this shifting arms control normative order is going to impact the South Asian strategic landscape. And number three, what are the prospects and challenges for Pakistan due to this emerging shift? Ladies and gentlemen, for that purpose, the ACDC has brought together members of national and international strategic community, share their thoughts to help understand this emerging transition. So with this brief introduction, now we formally begin our webinar. Before I invite Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry, Director General Institute of Studies for his welcome remarks, it would be an honor for me to introduce him. Before joining the Institute, Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry has served as a member of the Foreign Service of Pakistan for 37 years. His last diplomatic assignment was as Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States of America. Earlier, he served as the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan for over 3 years. He also served as a Foreign Office spokesman, Additional Foreign Secretary to the United Nations in New York, and Chief of Cabinet to the Secretary General of ECO in Iran. He has also authored a book titled Pakistan Mirror to Dutch Eyes, published by Sangamil Publication. Now I hand over the floor to Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry for his welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Qasim. My commendation to ACDC, Arms Control and Disarmament Center, where Qasim and his team have really worked hard to pay attention to this very important area of work for our institute and also for our country, and I would say for the world as a whole. It is also my pleasure to welcome the speakers, Tariq Rauf, Chang Chiao, and Michael Cripon. All of them are experts in their own field, and of course, my own colleague, Usman Jadoon, who has recently returned from CD in Geneva. Let me also join my voice in what Qasim had just mentioned, that a lot seems to be happening in this domain. And the INF has collapsed. Iran nuclear deal is in doldrums because of the US pullout. US and Russia have agreed to start the talks on New START, and we hope that they succeed, but if they don't, the treaty would expire in 2021, which would be a blow to the efforts for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Iran and Israel have launched their own military satellites, and Washington has been talking of a possible resumption of nuclear testing, which, if it happens, could be followed by countries like India. So these are unsettling times. We surely need to reflect on what all these existing arms control regimes have achieved and where have these failed. And an interesting aspect of today's discussion should be the larger picture of global arms control normative order, if I can use that term. Is the order transitioning from essentially bipolar to multipolar with an asymmetric distribution of power? A sustainable arms control order for the 21st century must accommodate this changing global power dynamics. Yet many reject the notion that a new order is needed. Regardless of that debate, I believe every nuclear state would need to work out how to adapt nuclear arms control regimes to which they are parties to the new realities. These are tough times for arms control regime, but international system has gone through tough times before as well. In the past, states concluded landmark agreements with political will, resilience, patience, determination, and commitment. Let's see if we can rise to the occasion this time when unilateralism seems to be on the rise and multilateralism on the retreat. With these few opening remarks, let me express my delight in seeing such stalwarts of this domain who will be expressing their thoughts, and I'm all ears. Back to you, Qasim.
Thank you, Mr. Sir, for extending a very warm welcome to our esteemed international panelists, international experts, and participants. So we have also arranged a briefing, a short briefing for our participants. And now I invite Ms. Amna Rafi. She is a research associate at the Arms Control Disarmament Center to give a short briefing on this weapon subject. Amna,
Thank you, Qasim. Assalamu alaikum and very warm welcome to all participants and speakers. I'm grateful to the Director General ISSI, Ambassador Azaz Ahmad Chaudhry, for his kind words in appreciation of our efforts. I totally agree with him that every nuclear state needs to work out how to adapt control regimes to new realities. So it is essential to identify what these new realities are. As highlighted by the Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry, the global power dynamic is shifting. The 2018 nuclear posture review is fixated on Russia, the national security strategy, as well as the national defense strategy indicates that US is refocusing on strategic competition among major powers. So in my view, the most and probably the most dangerous reality would be the new wave of military modernization and weaponization of emerging technologies. Arms control and military modernization always go together. If you could recall, the Nixon administration used the Trident system to get SWORD 1 agreement, and technological advancement played a decisive role in this case. US is leaving bilateral and multilateral arms control treaties to renegotiate these agreements and to re-establish new norms. But at the same time, US want to keep up existing norms in cyber domain. On the other side, Russia is ready to extend New START, and China want to stay on the sidelines of the nuclear arms control process. Both want new norms in cyber domain, and in fact, both are trying to establish an entirely new international legal regime for cyberspace. And on the issue of the lethal autonomous weapon systems, interestingly, both US and China share same point of view, and both does not currently support a ban on lethal autonomous weapon systems. So US even submitted a white paper on humanitarian benefits of the emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapons. So here we can see all the great powers are cherry picking arms control norms. So I agree with the view that the current strategic climate indicates mistrust and lack of political will on part of US and Russia for finding a plausible solution. And they might lose the last bilateral nuclear arms control agreement, but I differ with the view that if the US and Russia let the New START expire, then the entire arms control structure will break down or exhaust. So to end, great powers are trying to enhance their technological competitive edge. They are starting new arms race to gain strategic superiority, and after that they will renegotiate nuclear arms control agreement on new terms and conditions. And lastly, this transitional phase of massive military modernization at global level will also affect the peace and stability in South Asia. Military spending by India grew 6.8% to US dollars 71.1 billion in 2019, and India is massively expanding its conventional and nuclear weapons. So in the joint doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces, India has added a new triad of cyberspace, special operations, and outer space. And in addition to the traditional triad of land, air, and sea. So such shifts will ultimately impact the deterrent stability at regional level. So that's all from my side. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hear an extensive and productive discussion from this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Amna Rafiq, for giving us an excellent presentation and briefing on the subject. Now we move towards our eminent panel of experts. And the first speaker of today's webinar is Mr. Tariq Rauf. Mr. Rauf is a former head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. Alternate head of the IAEA, delegation to NPT conferences, IAEA liaison and point of contact for Nuclear Suppliers Group Committee, UNSCR 1540, coordinator of IAEA multilateral approaches to nuclear fuel cycle, IAEA forum on experience of nuclear weapons-free zone relevant for the Middle East. Now I invite Mr. Tariq Rauf to share his thoughts on changing global arms control norms, chances of great power competition. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa, for inviting me to join you in this very important forum. I also wanted to formally say hello to Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry. I last met you, Ambassador, if you recall, in Stockholm at the last Sherpa meeting for the 2016 Security Summit. So I'm very pleased to see you heading up the Strategic Studies Institute. You might not know, but at the very start of this institute in the mid-1970s, when Ross Massoud was the very first Director General I wrote a number of papers for ISSI at that time. And I'm also very pleased to see Usman Jadoon, who also was in Stockholm. He was here when I was at the agency, and also his successor, Husham, who is now the Director for Arms Control and Disarmament at the Foreign Ministry. And I just wanted to say a few words that I'm very glad that the new generation of young Pakistani diplomats like Usman, Husham, and some others are coming up very well. They're very well respected. They work very hard. And I think they are a big asset to the Foreign Service of Pakistan. And I think it would be well advised to keep them in the track because if we look at Pakistan's very best friend, China, and also its worst enemy, India, they have diplomats who are in the arms control track for years. And they master the issue, have institutional memory, and also have personal contacts. So I will talk very broadly since I was asked to speak on chances of great power competition. I will give a broad overview and then talk a little bit about one of the more recent initiatives on nuclear arms control and disarmament that is forwarded by the United States, and Pakistan is formally a part of it. So if you remember, several years ago, towards the end of the Cold War, there was a famous book called The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. He basically said that with the end of the Cold War, the old types of rivalries and competitions would no longer exist. But as we know, the end of history never really happened. We are facing history all over again with great power competition and rivalry alive and well. We had also heard about a unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union with sort of a Pax Americana. And the unipolar moment also, if it ever existed, does not exist anymore because there are challenges at the great power level to the US, both economically and also strategically and in the military realm. The Great War on Terrorism that was unleashed after September 2001 has had mixed success. We actually have more terrorism in other parts of the world than existed at the beginning of the previous decade. Now, the current orthodoxy is the Thucydides trap, or that war is inevitable between a rising power like China and an established or slightly declining power such as the US. I am on the side that the Thucydides trap is sort of imaginary. It's more a fallacy and not really real. There wasn't a war when the Soviet Union was rising. When the United States came out of the Second World War with a nuclear weapons monopoly, it took 4 years for the Soviet Union to join them in 1949. And in the subsequent decades, while there was a robust Cold War and rivalry in Europe and other parts of the world, the two sides assiduously avoided war. And I think the same would happen between China and the United States. The post-Second World War international system is now becoming obsolete and dysfunctional. The structure of the Security Council and other international institutions no longer reflects the current distribution of power. We now have in recent years the rise of nationalism and tribalism. We can see some of that in the response to the COVID, where some countries are buying up the entire stock of personal protective equipment or masks, or trying to buy vaccines as and when they become available. The effort for nation building in the Middle East, as we can all see, is in a very bad situation. Things are worse than before the various interventions. We now have the evolution of novel technologies, as was already referred to by Ms. Amna Rafiq in her short presentation. And some of these new technologies like artificial intelligence, cyber technologies, hypersonic weapon systems are very difficult to capture in the traditional framework of arms control and disarmament that we have known thus far. And finally, arms control and disarmament itself is now eroding. This has already been mentioned by Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry. We have an erosion of norms and treaties, and currently there is now only one nuclear arms control treaty extant between Russia and the United States. It doesn't seem likely that the US will agree to renew it when it expires in February 2021. Should that happen, for the first time in the history of Soviet, Russian, American nuclear arms control, there will be no treaty between the two sides. what we will lose with START are inspections, notifications, data exchanges, which will be a great loss. We also have, as some people call, an emerging G0 world, where there will not be a dominant single power, but there will be rivalry and competition, and we can already see this in the Pacific between China and the United States, and in parts of Europe and the Middle East between the Russian Federation and the United States as well. In the US Nuclear Strategy Review, they have openly called China now as a strategic competitor along with the Russian Federation. And it's the policy, as one can determine from the statements of the current administration in Washington, that the United States will prevent the rise of a peer military power, and they will compete against China from becoming a #1 economic power. So in my remaining few minutes, I wanted to talk about this new initiative that the United States has launched. They started off in March of 2018 at the preparatory committee meeting in Geneva, where the US announced this, creating the conditions for nuclear disarmament in the context of the NPT. This did not play very well as the United States cleared the table. They came up with the tabula rasa, and they eliminated all the agreed measures from 2010, 2000, and 1995 that were agreed in the NPT framework, such as de-alerting, reducing tactical nuclear weapons, and so on. And as a result of interventions by the participants, there are somewhere around 40 countries. Starting in 2019, the United States termed it as creating the environment for nuclear arms, for nuclear disarmament, or CEND. I'm one of the robust critics of this. I call this creating the environment to never disarm. So what the CEND has agreed to do in its 3 working groups is to look at threat perceptions involving nuclear weapons and security concerns. This will be chaired by the Netherlands and Morocco. Another working group will be chaired by South Korea and the United States, will be on best practices of international forums to improve the functioning of disarmament and non-proliferation forums. And the third is nuclear weapon use and risk reduction, chaired by Finland and Germany. At the moment, in the arms control discourse, nuclear risk reduction is the big issue. Former US Defense Secretary has published a new book called The Button, and for the last 2 years, he has been warning that the risks of inadvertent or accidental use of nuclear weapons now is higher than it ever was during the Cold War. Even the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has been moved to 100 seconds before midnight. This is the closest that it's ever been. Now, if we look at the CEND initiative, what it is not considering is, for example, US nuclear operations doctrine that was announced in June 2019 clearly posits using nuclear weapons to create conditions for decisive results and restoration of strategic stability. And for its part, the Russian military doctrine, as it was recently announced by President Putin, also envisages the early use of low-yield nuclear weapons to prevail in a conventional conflict where the Russian Federation might be on the losing end. The United States believes firmly that China has announced that by 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, China aims to be the world's predominant military power, and the US is not happy about that particular event happening, and the US will challenge the US. So finally, as has already been mentioned, the existing architecture of nuclear arms control from the Cold War has more or less collapsed. And now we have even a reluctance on the part of the United States to reaffirm the so-called Reagan-Gorbachev understanding that the nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must never be fought. All of the multilateral forums on nuclear arms control are deadlocked. We have a rollback in the NPT context of the outcomes of the previous 3 agreed review conferences. So we also now have, my final comments, competing proposals. So for the non-aligned movement, they still have their 3-phase time-bound plan of action for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Some of the Western states are still going by the step-by-step approach, where for them a fissile material cutoff treaty is the logical next step, but without inclusion of stocks. There was an initiative by 7 countries called the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative. They talk about building blocks for nuclear disarmament. Then we have the New Agenda Coalition, which talks about taking forward nuclear arms control and disarmament. And the New Agenda discussions indirectly led to the Humanitarian Initiative, which led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Sweden has its stepping stones approach, and in February this year, they issued a declaration calling for further arms reductions, but they again also focus only on nuclear risk rather than actual reductions and dealing with all types of nuclear weapons globally. And finally, we have the USCEND. So there is some confusion, overlapping efforts, and a complete lack of direction as to where we head with regard to nuclear disarmament and arms control at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for highlighting very important aspect of this emerging competition and also highlighting the new trends and new initiatives and the prospects. Now we'll move towards our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Zhao Chang. He's Director, China Arms Control and Disarmament Association. Mr. Chang is a research fellow and Director of Strategic Studies Security Program of CACTA. He began his work in China Institute of International Studies, CISS, in 2001. From 2002 to 2004, he worked for the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Then he posted to the Chinese Consulate General in Manchester, UK, and served as a Consul Attaché and Vice Consul until 2008. He was a Deputy Director of Foreign Relations Office and Research Fellow of CIIS from 2008 to 2000. Sir, now I invite you to share your thoughts on changing global arms control norms, prospects of engagement. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Malik. It's my great pleasure to attend this webinar hosted by CDC of ISSI. And as mentioned, I'm from China Arms Control and Disarmament Association. My organization enjoys a long-standing partnership with ISSI, so I'm very happy to see Ambassador Chaudhry and other colleagues of the arms control field in good health and spirit under the global crisis of COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope we can meet in person in the near future. So the topic of this webinar is changing global arms control norms. So I'm going to concentrate my remarks on two issues. First, the challenges of the current arms control regime, and second, my proposal of possible solutions. Well, regarding the challenges, as much has been said by the previous speakers, and I totally agree with, but I only want to highlight 3 points. The first, the return of the great power rivalry, as mentioned by Taraf or Rafik, brings with increased mutual inhibition as well as reduced willingness to cooperate in arms control. Some state is trying to contain and seek overwhelming military superiority over others in all fields. And in some cases, political ideology is introduced into international discourse on arms control and non-proliferation. So these behaviors are leading to heightened risks of arms race and confrontation. And second, the collapse of the bilateral arms control agreements between the US and Russia impairs the global strategic stability and has a negative impact on the multilateral arms control process. For a long time, the arms control process between the US and Russia is the driving force of the international arms control and disarmament, and served as the basis of the global strategic stability. So the collapse of these bilateral arms control agreements inevitably triggers a chain reaction. Now the negative impact on the multilateral arms control regime is unfolding. And as Tarek mentioned, that the disappointment on the global nuclear disarmament is exacerbating the distrust and discord between the non-nuclear weapon states and the nuclear weapon states in the NPT review process, casting a huge shadow on the success of the next NPT review conference. And third, the advances in the emerging technologies bring about new security challenges. The rapid development of technologies in outer space, in biology, cyberspace, and artificial intelligence has brought about a complicated and profound impacts on global security and strategic stability, creating new incentives for arms race. Nowadays, but there's a lot of discussion on the potential impact of machine learning and autonomy on the strategic stability and the nuclear risk, like how it can reduce the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence, and the possible usage of biologic technology such as gene editing in the military field raises great legal and ethic concerns from the international community. At the same time, there is a clear absence of international rules in these new domains. These are just some of the major challenges I think we are facing today in the arms control field. The future of the arms control depends on how we address these challenges. So I want to share my thoughts on the possible solutions. First, the concept of common security should be reinforced in arms control. The main reason behind the breaking of the current arms control regime is that the concept of common security is not cherished, and instead, unilateralism and pursuing absolute security through ways like gaining nuclear supremacy is becoming the order of the day in some states. Arms control is to acquire security, but it is not individual security. It is the common security and cooperative security of every relevant party. Last week marks the 5 years anniversary of the Iranian nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, which is regarded by the international community as a successful treaty because it respects each other's legitimate nuclear security concerns. And it brought peace and stability to the region at the beginning. But when the US withdrew and obstructed the implementation of the deal, the tension and conflict came back. So one of the many lessons we have learned in the past is that the arms control in the new age must be built on common security and commitment. My second suggestion is making collective efforts to maintain and improve the existing arms control framework. Arms control agreement usually takes years to accomplish. These hard-won treaties should not be abandoned easily, especially when we are facing an unpredictable future. We don't know whether we can reach any new agreement or how long it will take, or whether it will work at last. But we do know that the existing arms control regime has brought peace and stability to the world. Just look at the achievements of the NPT or the OPCW or the JCPOA. The disputes about the flaws or underperformance should be addressed under the framework of these treaties, instead of walking away or damaging the treaties. In addition, some existing arms control mechanism should be strengthened and fully utilized. For example, the periodic nuclear dialogue among the 5 NPT recognized nuclear weapon states, which is known as the P5 process, began more than a decade ago, has been playing an important role in safeguarding the NPT. In the context of the current international security situation, the P5 process needs to be enhanced with more dialogues on nuclear strategy and policy to have objective understanding of each other's strategic intentions and security concerns, and to prevent accident and crisis due to strategic miscalculation. Specific topics could include reducing the alert status of nuclear weapons or establishing nuclear crisis and risk notice mechanism. My third advice is that the military applications of emerging technologies must be regulated as soon as possible. An urgent task facing the arms control community is to establish necessary norms and rules for the military applications of these emerging technologies, while respecting and safeguarding the rights of all the state parties in their peaceful uses. Some progress has been made, like in the United Nations GE discussion on the lethal autonomous weapon system, the laws, 11 principle has been reached so
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. Now we'll move to our next speaker, And our next speaker is, hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Our third speaker. Now we'll move to our third speaker, Mr. Michael Clifford. Mr. Clifford co-founded the Stimson Center in 1989 and served as Stimson's president and CEO until 2000. He was appointed the University of Virginia's Diplomat Scholar, where he taught from 2001 to 2010. He is the author and editor of 22 books. He worked previously at the Carnegie Endowment, the State Department's Arms Control and Disarmament Agency during the Carter administration, and on Capitol Hill. He received the Carnegie Endowment Award for Lifetime Achievement in Non-Governmental Work to Reduce Nuclear Dangers in 2015. Now I request Mr. Michael Clifford to share his thoughts on emerging global arms control norms, future of arms control in South Asia. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Qasim. If I may call you Qasim.
Yeah, sure.
It's a great pleasure for me to be able to join you in this way. We live in a time of great lamentation. We live in a time of pandemic. And it's ravaging our societies, mine more than anybody else's. We live at a time where some of us complain about our political leadership. And it's a time of great political division, globally and sometimes nationally. On top of that, what everyone has said about the sorry state of arms control is also true. But because I am somewhat of a contrarian by nature, I'm going to try to confuse the picture a little bit. Excuse me. There are some aspects of our work that, in fact, have never been stronger. What do I mean by that? Well, two norms in particular have never been stronger. And since my job is to talk about norms, I'm going to focus on these two norms. The most important norm of all is that countries do not use nuclear weapons on battlefields. The last time they were used in this fashion was in 1945 to end a world war in which somewhere in excess of 50 million people died. Cities were firebombed, they were destroyed by conventional munitions, and 2 cities were destroyed by atomic bombs. That's the last time they've been used. Now, there is no treaty that prohibits the use of a nuclear weapon in warfare. Some have tried. Some believe it's a very worthwhile ambition to have such a treaty. But even without such a treaty, the norm of non-battlefield use has survived for 75 years. There were some close calls, there were accidents, there were terrible crises, there was poor situational awareness. And yet, these weapons have not been used on battlefields for 75 years. And believe me, during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, this norm could have been broken. It could not have gotten started. There were plenty of opportunities to use nuclear weapons. against China and threats against China were very prevalent in this period. On the Korean Peninsula, in Southeast Asia. And yet the norm of non-battlefield use took hold. It is 75 years old now, which means that it could be broken tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And we have to be totally vigilant in protecting this norm. But it is the very basis of our nuclear security. Because once the bomb is used again on a battlefield, then it will be extremely difficult to prevent further use in South Asia or anywhere else. But because the norm is 75 years old, every day that passes, every crisis that passes without nuclear weapons use on a battlefield makes it even harder for a national leader to cross this threshold. Who wants to be the leader who lives in infamy for the rest of recorded history, as long as there is recorded history, who has broken this norm? So as bad as everything else is around us, we have this norm, and it's absolutely crucial. There's a second extremely important norm. And this norm is that countries that possess the weapon do not test it. India and Pakistan haven't tested since 1998, more than 20 years ago. Some of us haven't tested since the early 1990s. The P5 haven't tested since 1996. We have stigmatized nuclear weapons to the extent that nations do not even test them. Now, there is one country that may test again. It's not going to be the United States, by the way. We won't go first, regardless of the rumblings you hear. You have to trust me on this. All hell will break loose in this country if somebody tries to test a nuclear weapon. And the Congress won't allow it. And the people who bet money in the casinos in Las Vegas won't allow it. It's not going to happen in the United States. It's not going to happen first in the United States. Now, we can get to these whispers of tests at test sites if you like in the Q&A. But there have been no nuclear weapon explosions. There have been experiments, but there have been no nuclear weapon explosions by any responsible state. That is to say, any state other than North Korea for over 20 years. And if North Korea should test again, it will reaffirm its outlier status, and nobody else is going to follow North Korea's lead. Now, we also ought to make it very hard on North Korea to test again. But think of this. Think of this testing, this norm against not testing nuclear weapons, which is now over 20 years old. Every other kind of weapon is tested because they are presumed usable in warfare. We test missiles. They may or may not carry nuclear weapons, but we test them. We obviously test our airplanes. We test our submarines. We test tanks. We test other things. We don't test nuclear weapons. We are, even amidst the collapse of some treaties, honoring this norm. Every day that passes without a test of a nuclear weapon helps to stigmatize these weapons. You don't use them in warfare, and they are so stigmatized you do not even test them. And every day that passes, this norm too is becoming stronger. Now, these norms are not enough. Deterrence is dangerous. It is the nature of deterrence that people want to strengthen it. Even without testing, they want to strengthen deterrence. And you strengthen deterrence by making more and more credible threats of use. That is the nature of deterrence. If your neighbor is testing a missile, you got to test the missile. If your neighbor is working to improve sea-based capabilities, you have to work on improving sea-based capabilities. Deterrence is dangerous. Deterrence needs reassurance in order to be safe. Now, some of us, the US and Russia in particular, have used arms control treaties as a form of reassurance. So every treaty we've negotiated and every treaty that's entered into force between the United States and Soviet Union and Russian Federation has helped to distinguish nuclear weapons as being a breed apart. But treaties do not have a promising future, at least in the near term. In my country, treaties require 2/3 of the United States Senate to provide advice and consent. And polarization in the United States is so great that it's hard to envision a treaty reaching that standard unless it's negotiated by a Republican president. So if we need reassurance to go along with deterrence, because deterrence is dangerous. And if we don't have arms control treaties, new ones, to provide that reassurance, and if some countries, such as in your part of the world, Pakistan, India, China, you can't do treaties. You're not going to do a trilateral treaty. And the United States isn't going to do a trilateral treaty with China and Russia either. We could. The next president could extend New START. The lawyers will have to get involved. That's possible. But if treaties are not there for us to provide reassurance the way they were in the past, then what are we left with? And what are you left with who do not have the potential to have treaties? We are left with norms. And we have to rely increasingly on norms when treaties fall by the wayside. And the most important norms are no battlefield use and no testing. Now, the no battlefield use norm, and I'll stop here because I want to address my colleagues in Pakistan. And I miss you all. I'm sorry I'm not able to visit. It's been way too long. But what do we do when countries have doctrines like Pakistan and the United States, when countries have doctrines that embrace first use? When we know that first use would have horrific consequences. But we still embrace first use because we think it strengthens deterrence. And deterrence is dangerous. And the most dangerous part of deterrence is first use. So those of us who have doctrines that embrace first use have a problem on our hands. And it's not a problem we can fix, because we're not going to change our doctrines. So I'll leave you with this thought. Whether you embrace a doctrine of first use or not, for 75 years, these weapons have not been usable or used on battlefields. And relying on first use after 75 years of non-use is a very weak read. So we have to support our national security in other ways. And we need to try to revive diplomacy as well. Because first use, after 75 years, not only breaks the most important norm that we've got, but it opens the gates of hell. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkwood, for giving a very deep insight. And I hope that norms of not testing and not using remains there. Now we will like to move towards our last speaker. The fourth and last speaker of this webinar is Mr. Usman Jadoon, Director, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Jadoon is a Pakistani diplomat with extensive experience of working on arms control issues, having served as consular in charge of Disarmament Affairs at Pakistan Mission in Geneva from 2013 to 2020, Director of Arms Control and Disarmament at Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Islamabad from 2011 to 30, and the lead expert covering the International Atomic Energy at Pakistan Mission in Vienna. He has been a regular member of Pakistan's delegation to the UN General Assembly First Committee and other WBMD-related meetings in New York and elsewhere. Now I invite Mr. Usman Jadoon to share his thoughts on changing global norms, prospects and challenges for Pakistan. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Malik Qasim Saab. Thank you for the invitation. I feel honored speaking at this wonderful institute, which has made great strides under the remarkable leadership of Ambassador Aizaz Chaudhry, including the establishment of this Arms Control and Disarmament Center. I also consider it a privilege to be part of such a sterling cast of co-panelists, each one of them being distinguished experts, academics, and practitioners of their fields. Following the introduction and overview provided by Ambassador Chaudhry, the panelists have already enlightened us with their incisive analysis on the different dimensions of changing global arms control norms. My remarks will focus on the prospects and challenges arising for Pakistan from these changing norms. A norm, as we all know, is a general standard or trend that emerges from repeated use and behavior without any formal legal sanction. Norms can be prohibitive in terms of dissuading certain conduct, but they can also be permitting in sense of normalizing certain behavior as acceptable. I draw this distinction here because arms control could evolve in both directions. I would elaborate briefly in the time that I have left 4 topical norms, or you could even call them trends, and try to explain their impact in the South Asian regional security context, which largely shapes Pakistan's perspectives. I will also try to link them to the diplomatic engagements and strategy of Pakistan. And I would limit myself to issues related to nuclear arms control and strategic weapons systems only, meaning I will not cover chemical, biological, or conventional arms related issues. So the first trend, major trend, is, many of you have mentioned it, modernization and upgradation of existing arsenals and delivery systems. This trend is most pronounced in the case of US and Russia. US being the most transparent, we know how much they spend, where it will be spent on. These are the 2 largest and oldest nuclear weapon states. Maintenance for ensuring safety and reliability was always part of their stockpile stewardship since long, once they stopped testing. But large-scale modernization is a more recent phenomenon. It had already taken off in the US during the previous administration and is not a new phenomenon, but it has assumed more prominence and urgency lately, I feel. When practiced by major players and countenanced by others, or others being simply resigned to it, a permissive norm is born, I think. So despite being against the aspiration of global zero, modernization and upgradation is no longer seen as, for lack of a better word, bad. So in my view, this is one of the clear trends that has emerged. In terms of impact on South Asia, I would say that the protagonists in this region are still within the first phase or first wave of weaponization. So they never really ceased, and for them to restart or remodernize or upgrade their arsenals, we are perhaps still in the first phase because of operational reasons. And if you ask me what prospects and challenges it brings for Pakistan, I think it lifts whatever little pressure there ever was to freeze qualitative or quantitative development of nuclear weapons. So in that sense, this is a permissive norm. New weapon systems is the second trend that I wanted to include in my talk. New weapon systems are of 2 types. One is the traditional weapons, which is nuclear weapons, warheads, delivery systems, like tactical nuclear weapons with variable yields, new types of warheads, hypersonics, cruise missiles, nuclear-powered cruise missiles, which can fly for 24 hours while they look for their targets. And then there is also new exotic types of weapons, which are new class of weapons. For instance, artificial intelligence-powered lethal autonomous weapon systems, cyber weapons, weapons in outer space, etc. The latter category, the newer category, is marked by a total lack of legally binding instruments or any regulatory regime. This makes them different from the previous, I mean, the other category, which I call traditional weapons, because there at least there are some existing norms and regimes. So the norm that we could derive or deduce from this is that since both categories are being openly developed and mostly unchallenged, it is permitted. It's kosher, go ahead, do it. In terms of impact in South Asia, India is actively pursuing both of these categories of weapons. The latter, the second novel category, India is much more interested than Pakistan because it wants to beat the non-proliferation and export control regimes, which are bound to come in at some stage. India is in fact the only NAM member that is opposed to a legally binding instrument or legally binding regulations on lethal autonomous weapons. India's hegemonic designs and great power ambitions are on crass display and self-evident. It is steadily building up its triad and perfecting assured second strike capabilities with active support, of course, from Western countries. So Pakistan has to take a cautious approach and has to respond. In my view, actions have been restrained, but not at the cost of compromising on our deterrence credibility. So we've had to take counteractions. But I also wanted to say that, let's say it becomes a strategic necessity for Pakistan because of some degradation in our defensive capabilities, Pakistan's calculus can change. And it could move towards acquisition of these newer weapon systems or expand its own capabilities. The third, some of you have mentioned also, the third trend that I wanted to mention was institutional decay. And this is both in terms of bilateral treaties like INF and Open Skies, as well as plurilateral arrangements like JCPOA with Iran, etc., but also a general lack of interest in multilateral arms control forums, such as UN's Conference on Disarmament, IAEA, etc. The new talk, at least in DC, is about era of trilateral arms control and shedding away this bilateral paradigm. I wish we could talk more about this with Mr. Michael Crepon during the questions and answers. Tariq has also mentioned a very interesting thing about CEND, and I also hope we will discuss that during the ensuing discussion. So one point here in institutional decay, we in Pakistan see nuclear supplies group, we follow it very carefully, and the rot there started during the Obama administration. So it is also sometimes unfair to unfairly blame Trump administration for perhaps showing disdain for multilateral institutions. In case of NSG, although the waiver was approved during Republican administration of President Bush, the promises of membership and the most active lobbying was done during the Obama administration. And in fact, the trend, at least in NSG with Trump administration, from Pakistan's point of view, wasn't that bad. The greatest impact of any of the four norms that I will mention, I'm presently on the third one, in South Asia is from this one, institutional rot or institutional decay. Why I say that? Because we have very little bilateral channels of communication, little bilateral treaties, or very few CBMs of a limited scope. So in terms of Pakistan and India, what constrains our capabilities, or if we want something constrained in amongst India's capabilities, this is perhaps the only avenue available to us. So this is where we pay the most attention. And the other are macro level trends, mostly played out between major powers with some knock-on effects, but we are not probably a direct player there. But here, in terms of institutional decay in the CD, in the IAEA, in the UN, we face more impact. So Pakistan, of course, watches this very closely. And these last few years have been of more or less a pause and not good from my point of view. We maintain a high profile in multilateral arms control fora because of this reason. We can discuss more later. My fourth trend, some of you also mentioned, was lack of disarmament. There has been significant backtracking from unilateral declarations and agreed commitments in various fora. TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also failed to take off, perhaps not to the liking of its proponents, but it could be another discussion topic altogether, but for the moment, it has not had that normative effect which was desired by the proponents. So two elements, risk reduction and nuclear disarmament verification, have sort of emerged as the new practical doable things, and disarmament has taken a back seat. Pakistan, in terms of diplomatic engagement, has a principled position, tries to stick to it and promote it faithfully. It's based on adherence to a cardinal principle, which is equal and undiminished security for all states, not for a select few, and pursuing arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, confidence building, restraint measures in a manner that leaves everyone better off, or at least does not leave anyone worse off. This has been our prime focus. To conclude, I would say that in the norms that have endured, Mr. Crepon mentioned two, non-use and non-testing. I also wanted to speak a bit about them. So the non-use norm perhaps is not so much of a normative norm or a stigmatizing or a taboo norm, but you could also argue that it's because of deterrence having held and no thresholds having been crossed. And having worked on fissile material for a number of years, I also wanted to plug that in. Despite attempts of making a norm out of fissile material production, it did not happen. it could not even happen amongst the P5. 4 announced a moratorium, the 5th one didn't. And in case of India, which outwardly holds a commitment to not oppose negotiations, has not announced a moratorium or has not stopped production. And even the NSG waiver and the whatever formulas have been worked out for NSG membership do not include any condition that they do so. So it has not been able to emerge as a norm, even at the best of times. So my last thought, perhaps point to ponder is which one of these trends is temporary and transient and which one is reversible. For instance, we see President Biden coming to power in the US, which of these would reverse? In my view, my assessment, the institutional decay or the multilateralism could be arrested and reversed. Also, the declaratory positions on disarmament could change, the declaratory positions. But the first two, the modernization and upgradation, and the development of new types of traditional weapons and new types of other exotic weapons would not. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Smarjatul, for giving a very excellent perspective on future challenges and prospects for Pakistan in reference to this achieving global norms. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you all the participants for giving us an excellent remarks and sharing their thoughts on these subjects. Now we open the question and answer session, and those who want to raise questions, they can identify themselves and they can also identify the speaker to whom they want to ask that question. In the chat, we have also received a lot of questions, and I'll go according to their order. And first of all, I would hand over the floor to Ambassador Azam Chaudhry for his comments and questions. Sorry, you have the floor.
Well, I think, thank you so much. The final part of Usman Jadoon's assessment as to which trends are transient and reversible and which are permanent, I would like to hear from Michael and Chao Chang and Tariq Rauf also as to their assessment, which norms are holding and which will not hold in their views.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. Michael, you have the floor.
You know, these two norms that I'm so possessive of, that are so important, became norms in a very transient way. They became norms one day at a time. And in the case of non-battlefield use, one crisis at a time. So because they're long-lasting and yet still transient, we could lose them. We could lose them in the next crisis. And Usman, who carries on a long tradition of really talented Pakistani diplomacy in this field, reminds us that deterrence has something to do with these transient and yet long-lasting norms. And he's right. But deterrence has a very spotty track record. So far, deterrence has held in the two most important cases. We have not had nuclear exchanges. We have not had battlefield use. And we have not had major conventional war between states that possess nuclear weapons. Those are very important things we have to thank deterrence for. But deterrence fails in every other case. Deterrence doesn't prevent limited conventional war. You know that. It doesn't prevent border skirmishing in your part of the world. It doesn't prevent increases in tension. It doesn't assure victory in war. Nuclear weapon possessors can relate to this. They can relate to the limitations of deterrence. Deterrence doesn't work when it comes to compellence. It doesn't work in your region, in trying to compel behavior. It doesn't work. Hasn't worked for the United States either, or Russia. And we'll see about China. So there's this paradox where something that is transient and that can be something important is also transient and can be lost. But have now gained decades of respect. The modernization aspect is a part of a nuclear weapon possessor state's life. It will continue. The numbers, the rise in numbers, and we worry about this as treaties go by the wayside. There's a very important factor here that is not treaty-based, and that is these weapon systems, as they are modernized, are obscenely expensive. And we have other needs for our money because our societies are hurting. So I don't see arms racing the way we had in the past, even without treaties.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Mr. Chang, sir, would you like to respond to Ambassador Azhar's question?
Yes. I'm sorry. I think I just have some problem with my computer. So I tried to fix it. I hope it's working now. And so regarding the norms, I think that if you look at the norms in the arms control field, we can see that pretty much the bilateral agreements between the US and Russia or the Soviet Union has collapsed. But the multilateral agreements in arms control field are still there. Like if you look at NPT, the OPCW, the BWC, so all these multilateral arms control agreements are still there. So I think that's our focus should be try to maintain and improve the existing multilateral arms control agreements framework. In that case, that we can move forward and to hold the basis, and so we can create, like in the future, we can have more, maybe not legally binding or law-based arms control agreements, but something like the political declaration or some rules of law, rules of roads, something like that. So that's my answer to the Ambassador Chaudhry. So I also say I want to echo the Michael's view that I agree with Michael that the nuclear deterrence policy based on the first use of nuclear weapons is itself one of the greatest threats to the international peace and stability. So I think it's very important for the nuclear weapon states to have the low first use doctrine. So actually, the US, we all know that the China has always the low first use policy, and actually in the 1994, US proposed initiative that the 5 nuclear weapon states should adopt a no first use policy against each other. So, but there is no, we know that there is without a successful result. But I hope that this initiative can be proposed again within the P5 process, because we are facing a very dangerous security environment nowadays. And I also see the question from the Tarek about whether China will join the CEND in the future. Actually, I don't know, because I'm not the government official, but from my observation, I think that China has some concerns over the CEND. from my observation, I think that one of the, at least there are three concerns. That's first, that because China think that the initiative from the CND is not consensus based, it's majority based. So that is not, we think it's very a good way to reach an initiative from this process. And also, I think that the CND is not, it's a bit of lack of representativeness because the majority of the CND states are from the Western countries. And the third, I think that maybe from my observation that the CND maybe somewhat will weaken the authority of the Conference of Disarmament. You like that you start a new process in parallel with this Conference of Disarmament. So I think that at least these concerns is stopped China to join the CAD in the future maybe, but I don't know. I hope that maybe we can have more constructive multilateral disarmament process going on, but I don't know whether this is one is working.
Thank you, Mr. Chen, for answering both the questions. I believe there are two or more questions to address to Mr. Rauf from the participants. And one question is from Mr. Khalid Banouri, that could you expand on the thoughts on CEND, to elaborate what the US hopes to achieve from this initiative? And there's another question from Ms. Ghazala, and she asked that how other great powers are going to respond to this CEND initiative. So would you like to respond to these questions?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I would add I'm more of a pessimist. I think all of the norms that Usman talked about are vulnerable and can be broken. After all, the norm against the use of chemical weapons has been broken. And now technology and policy in some of the nuclear weapon states is already moving in a direction that makes it easier to break the norm should the need arise. Already the distinction now between low-yield nuclear weapons and high-yield conventional weapons is becoming very dubious. And actually one can foresee, or even there are deployed, some tactical or low-yield nuclear weapons that have a very low yield, 1,000, 1 kiloton, 2 kilotons, which is less than the mother of all bombs, which was 10,000 kilotons. Already on 2 US ballistic missile submarines, they are carrying 2 ballistic missiles each, which have a low-yield nuclear warhead on them. The justification for that is to use these in a regional conflict below the level of a central exchange or a central conflict or a central war with the Soviet Union, or to fight a naval war. The US believes that the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy now has more ships than the US Navy, even though the quality and capabilities of the US Navy ships are greater. But the US feels that China wants to drive the US out of the Pacific, and that is why it's developing these weapon systems. Already the US carrier battle groups are now deployed at a greater distance from Chinese shores. So those who argue about the use of nuclear weapons that would conform with international humanitarian law and not cause collateral damage or non-combatant fatalities make the case that one could use nuclear weapons at sea to sink an aircraft carrier or battleships, and only military casualties would be incurred. This is a very dubious way of justifying the retention and use of nuclear weapons, because one cannot guarantee that the attacked party will not respond in some other theater and in some other manner. With regard to the creating the environment for nuclear disarmament initiative of the US, this is an initiative by invitation, just like the 4 nuclear security summits. Some 40 countries are invited. I am in close contact with many of these countries, and many of their representatives privately tell me that they really they did not want to attend. But when an invitation comes from a country as powerful as the United States, and particularly in these times, it was very difficult for them to say no. And therefore, they reluctantly went to attend the meetings of the CEND, the two of them that have taken place. Others said, well, we don't like this initiative, but we will try and change it from within. It's better to be in the room than outside the room. And there is some limited success because the United States has changed some of the parameters of their original thinking. But one of the main criticisms, and I agree with the criticisms voiced by Mr. Zhu, the US originally presented this in the NPT context. And as I pointed out, the US has swept aside all the agreed outcomes to which the US itself was a willing party in the past. And since the US now no longer abides by Pacta Sunt Servanda, that countries are obligated to abide by their international agreements, as in the case of the JCPOA and a number of other agreements, this sends a very bad message. And in the NPT context, this is not the way to go. And since it's by invitation, it means some are invited and some are not invited. And those countries that are the most active, I now refer to them as the captive nations, just as we used to call the allies of the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Treaty Organization as captive nations, where the United States proposes something and a few of these allies jump up and salute and do the needful. One example was when the Bush administration, that is the Bush Jr. administration, proposed a fissile material cutoff treaty without any verification. And within 2 weeks, Australia tabled a draft treaty at the Conference on Disarmament, which was a few paragraphs on one page with no verification. And there are a number of other countries that are now doing exactly the same in the CEND. And Usman mentioned nuclear disarmament verification. This is the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, which is separate from the group of governmental experts on verification established under the UN. In the IPNDV, it's again the same. The captive nations or the loyal allies are doing a lot of the running. It's virtually agreed that it will be impossible to do multilateral verification of the dismantlement of actual nuclear warheads. So the viable path is the South Africa model, where each possessor dismantles its own warheads. The nuclear material coming out of it, plutonium and highly enriched uranium, goes under international monitoring and verification, which is where also a fissile material cutoff treaty, including stocks, becomes very important. Already, we have 1,500 tons, that is 1,500,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and 500 metric tons of plutonium. That's 500,000 kilograms of plutonium in the military fuel cycles, completely outside any monitoring. This is good for 130,000 nuclear warheads. And so these are the things that we need to focus on. Risk reduction. Well, who has created these risks? The risks have been created by nuclear weapons modernization, by developing new types of delivery systems, by moving to low-yield nuclear weapons, by enunciating doctrines that envisage the early use of nuclear weapons. So the nuclear weapon states, some of them pollute their own nest, and then they ask the rest of us to clean it up. And finally, one of the main criticisms of CEND, which I should have mentioned earlier, is that the US now has put the onus on creating the environment for nuclear disarmament on the non-nuclear weapon states, that they need to create the environment so that the nuclear weapon states feel confident enough to reduce their nuclear weapons, which is a bizarre notion. I'm informed that the Russian Federation apparently is no longer interested in attending CEND, and likely the Chinese position is not far from that, and I think Mr. Zhu indirectly indicated that as well. I personally have been a critic of my Pakistani friends who happily went to CEND because for Pakistan, finally, it's a seat at the top table. The same is true of India, where they're sitting with the 5 established nuclear weapon states. But I doubt very much that Pakistan's threat perceptions and Pakistan's vulnerabilities and the threats posed to Pakistan by its nuclear armed neighbor will actually be discussed in any meaningful manner in the CEND. And Pakistan, unfortunately, then will be giving legitimacy to the CEND initiative by being present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tariq. There are another 2 questions which are addressed to Mr. Michael Cripon. One question is from Mr. Shah Mohammed, that has the norm of 75 years of non-use more a result of NFU doctrine or the behavior of states, especially during time of crisis? How can the developments related to aggressive force posturing, including increasing readiness, clusterization of delivery system, dual-use platform, hypersonic system, and absence of crisis management mechanism affect the norm of non-use in the long term? There is also a similar question addressed to Michael Capone by Ghazala, that US and other states' actions are in contravention of the norm of non-use of nukes. Why develop new nuclear weapons and abrogate checks in the form of arms control? Mr. Capone, would you like to respond to these questions?
They're good questions. The norm of non-use in warfare has survived nuclear doctrine. When it's all well and good for military officers, well-meaning military officers, to come up with these doctrines of nuclear weapons employment, first or second or whatever. But no one, and there have been a lot of smart people working on nuclear deterrence, nobody has figured out a realistic plan of escalation control once the nuclear threshold is crossed. And this proves to be a pretty extraordinary constraint on doctrine. So regardless of what your doctrine is, whether you want everybody to know you're willing to use it first or not, you're faced with the problem of uncontrolled escalation. And that's a powerful disincentive against first use. And this is one of the reasons why we have a norm that's 75 years old now. A norm that nobody expected. Nobody expected 75 years of non-use after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So why in the world do these nuclear weapons enclaves continue to produce nuclear weapons? And why do they produce new types? Well, they're not really new types, because truly a new type requires testing. So they're modifications of old types that don't require testing. Why? Well, I think regardless of what doctrines our countries may assert, we all have the same institutional, bureaucratic, and political imperatives. We may not agree with them. This low-yield Trident warhead that Tariq is so concerned about, and I respect his view. He's earned that respect. But I don't agree with him. It will be just as hard for an American president to authorize the use of a low-yield warhead than it will be for the use of a higher yield warhead. One of the great benefits of 75-year-long norm of non-use is that it doesn't matter what the design is. It doesn't matter what the yield is. And as much as deterrence strengtheners would like us to think otherwise, we will be just as opposed to the use of that warhead. We have to protect this norm. It's the most important norm we've got. And as treaties, bilateral treaties, go by the wayside, it becomes even more important.
Thank you, Mr. Kripa. I believe there's still some more questions, but since we're running out of time, and here I would like to add that some of our participants want to make some remarks, and I would invite them to just make a short comment on this. Mr. Khalid Bonuri wants to make some remarks. Farhan, can you open mic of Mr. Khalid Bonuri? Bonuri Sahab, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all this. This has been a fascinating discussion. My short reaction to the discussion that I've heard is that the problem with this whole situation appears to be that the trends are already challenging these norms. In the absence of a significant attempt for some kind of regulatory treaty-based progress, norms are all that you've got, but the trends are already challenging them, whether you look at the way the new weapons or the issue of trends that still flow from United States. The word I can believe is in a transition towards multipolar or is almost there, but several countries still look at the trends the way they flow from the US, and those trends are all negative in this direction, and there have been so many references to it. So let me quickly make one cross-reference of a historical sense. There were two significant moments in history, and we all know about that, when the international community actually got together and did something for arms control. And that was regretfully only when millions had already died, when the initiative of the League of Nations came, or the United Nations itself was set up. Now, the current situation that we are in, and I'm going to walk away from the nuclear arms control for a moment and say the pandemic seems to suggest that if Spanish flu is any kind of historical relevance to this situation, millions are going to die or can die. But this hasn't led us to taking anything concrete. In fact, the trends are suggesting that it's in reverse. The WHO is being ignored. And if you want to walk back to the situation of Balakot, the right of self-defense that is permissible by the UN Charter wasn't supported for Pakistan, despite the fact that all the actions that we took were precisely in line with Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, those trends. So the trends are already negative. Does that mean this can go on a bad path? Now, I know I'm quite struck by where Michael started from by saying that you're going to confuse the picture a little bit. Here's a bit of more confusion. Where would it head then in case this very, very tricky situation goes into a further nosedive? That's the reflection that I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalid. With this, we come to an end to the question and answer session. And now we move towards our last segment of this webinar. Concluding remarks by Mr. Khalid Mahmood. Would I like to introduce Mr. Saab? Mr. Khalid Mahmood is a former ambassador of Pakistan to Iran, Iraq, China, Saudi Arabia, and Mongolia. He has served as First Secretary and later as Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations, New York. He has worked as Director General UN, Additional Secretary of United Nations, Asia Pacific, and Africa, and former Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the Organization of Islamic Conference and the Economic Cooperation Organization. Mr. Khalid Mahmood Saab, you have the floor.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's never too late to greet people, so I would venture to extend very warm greetings to all the participants of this webinar. It has been really a treat to hear these acknowledged experts in the field of arms control. Arms control norms have played a decisive role in achieving international peace and stability throughout history, especially during the Cold War. The two superpowers realized that the balance of terror and confrontation is neither desirable nor sustainable, so they agreed to codify their shared understanding of arms control and disarmament. They collectively designed the global arms control normative order as a risk reduction tool through confidence building measures and bilateral and multilateral arms control agreements. They not only designed this normative order, but also institutionalized it to ensure verification, compliance, and achieve stable deterrence. Now, this normative order remained intact and effective even in the post-Cold War and post-9/11 eras. But today, this arms control normative order is, as has been pointed out, eroding. States are opting out of these arms control treaties and institutions. And those states which are still party to these arrangements are lukewarm in complying with the rules. So why we have reached to this low point? The contributing factors are the great power competition. As we know, whenever there has been harmony between the great powers, that has been conducive to the adoption of these normative structure. Another factor is that the US obsession of including China in trilateral arms control agreement and US disregard of these norms and focus on unilateralism instead of multilateralism. So states are also apprehensive of the asymmetrical nature of global arms control norms. The realization that the existing regimes is discriminatory. This is also a feeling shared by many countries. So the chances of improvement, in my view, at the moment are quite bleak. States continue to invest, in fact, in military modernization and new technologies, resulting in renewed confrontation and global arms race also seems to be imminent. So, you see, I think one of the factors which has contributed to this situation has been the decisive role or the impact of US decisions of threat to resume nuclear testing or to opt out of INF and not renewing START 2 or walking out of the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. All these things had a negative impact on this effort at arms control rules, So I would, to sum up, I would say that, see now Russia and United States are no longer engaged in arms control negotiation. And already INF is dead. The very little prospects of extension of START 2. So this continued alienation between Russia and the West, I think that is not a good foreboding for future progress in this field, especially when we combine it with the new military technological developments, which will surely undermine the strategic stability, whatever level we had. So a new arms race is looming, I think, with severe implications from nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and regional stability. See, the collapse of the INF treaty could have been prevented, but it's never too late. I think still the powers which matter, they can resume now. After extending the START 2, they can start negotiations to bring back the fundamentals of INF treaty again. But of course, this new model should take into account the new arms, and in the new fields, outer space, cyberspace. So this effort is, I think, worth taking. So far, there has been focus on the number of arsenals a country possesses. I think in future, the quality of these arsenals would also have to be factored in. Now, as regards the testing of the nuclear explosions, I think Mr. Capron has pointed out that it has become a norm, no testing, no use. But I think these norms are quite fragile. They are under constant challenge and threat. But I think this should be our effort to not only make these norms stronger, but also to further build upon such norms to meet the challenges of the new world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Musa, for your concluding remarks. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, with this we come to an end to our webinar. And once again, I thank you all the participants, especially the speakers, Mr. Osman Jatoon, Mr. Michael Kripon, Mr. Chen Zhou, Mr. Tariq Rauf, for taking out time from their busy schedule and joining us for this webinar. And I also thank you, Mr. Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry and Mr. Khalid Mahmood for their time and for their support and guidance for establishing this arms control and disarmament center. Thank you once again. Stay
Thank
safe.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Very kind.
Khalid, it's good seeing you.
Good seeing you too.
Thank you.